In the sleepy coastal town of Harbour's Edge, where salt-laden winds whisper tales of the sea, a ruthless motorcycle gang made the gravest mistake of their lives. They chose to terrorize the wrong fisherman's teenage son. The coastal reapers couldn't have known that the quiet man who spent his days on an old trawler, hauling nets and selling his catch at the local market, was once the most decorated combat diver in Navy SEAL history, with more classified missions than their entire gang had. Members combined, the morning fog rolled thick across Harbour's Edge Marina, wrapping the fishing boats in a ghostly shroud as Mick Callahan worked methodically on the deck of his weathered trawler. Second chance. His calloused hands, marked with scars few would understand, moved with fluid precision as he checked his nets and prepared for another day at sea. The rhythmic slap of waves against wooden hulls and the distant cry of seagulls created a peaceful symphony he'd come to cherish over the past 12 years. Oliva Chen watched from her harbourmaster's office as Mick went about his morning routine. After all these years, she still marveled at how a man could move with such efficiency on a rolling deck, each motion calculated and smooth, as if the unstable surface were solid ground. The other fishermen respected Mick, though few really knew him. He kept to himself, sold his catch without haggling, and never caused trouble. But Oliva had been harbour-master long enough to notice things others missed, like how Mick's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, not just for weather but for something else. How he could hold his breath longer than any fisherman she'd known when diving to check his hull. How he never seemed to tire, no matter how rough the seas or long the day. Little things that made her wonder about the man who'd appeared in their town 12 years ago, looking for peace but carrying shadows in his eyes. Tommy Callahan, Mick's 16-year-old son, emerged from below deck, his dark hair tousled from sleep. "Morning, Dad," he called, grabbing a coil of rope with the easy familiarity of someone born to the sea. Mick's weathered face softened slightly as he watched his boy work. Tommy had his mother's eyes and smile, reminders of what Mick had lost, and what he still had to protect. The morning routine continued as other boats began stirring to life. Old Jack Peterson on the Mary Rose waved as he passed, his vessel loaded with crab pots. Dr. David Hayes, the town's physician who enjoyed early morning fishing before his clinic opened, headed out in his small Boston whaler. The harbour slowly awakened, like a small town itself coming to life. Deputy Mark Wilson's patrol boat approached, cutting a clean wake through the morning mist. "Mick," he called, his voice carrying across the water. "Got a moment?" Something in the deputy's tone made Mick pause in his work, that same instinct that had kept him alive in darker waters stirring to life. "Trouble?" Mick asked as Wilson tied up alongside, his voice carrying that quiet quality that made people lean in to hear. The deputy's boots scraped softly on the deck as he stepped aboard. "Maybe. Got word from Stonebridge Harbour that a motorcycle gang's been causing problems up the coast, calling themselves the Coastal Reapers. They've been targeting local businesses, fishing boats especially." Mick's hands continued their work with nets, though his movements had taken on a different quality, more measured, more controlled. "Protection money?" Wilson nodded grimly. "Started with demands for security fees. When people refused to pay." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Mick set down his net with precise care. "How far out?" 20 miles now," Wilson replied, watching Mick's face carefully. "Moving this way, led by a guy calls himself Steel Jack Morrison, ex-Navy, dishonorable discharge, mean streak a mile wide." The morning light caught the silver in Mick's hair as he reached for another net, his movements now carrying a weight that Oliva, watching from her office window, recognized. Most people would have missed it, but she saw how his actions had changed, become even more controlled, like a man carefully holding something in check. Dr. Hayes pulled his boat alongside, cutting his engine. Might be time to consider hiring some security for the harbour, Oliva. Town this size, Mark here can't be everywhere. Mick's hands stilled completely for a moment. Harbour this size shouldn't need security, he said quietly. Not if people stand together. The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Wilson studied his old friend's face, seeing perhaps something there that others missed. The two men had known each other since their service days, though neither ever spoke of those times. Some fights aren't worth picking, Mick, Wilson said softly. Not anymore. Mick resumed his work, but his eyes had taken on a distant look. Some fights pick you, Mark, whether you want them or not. A motorcycle's rumble echoed from the waterfront, drawing everyone's attention. It passed without stopping, but the tension in the air didn't fully dissipate. Oliva watched as Mick methodically checked his diving gear, his movements precise as ever, but now carrying a different quality, like a shark trying to move like a common fish. The fog began to lift as the morning sun strengthened, revealing a harbour that suddenly seemed smaller, more vulnerable. Tommy worked alongside his father, unaware of the undercurrent of tension, but Mick's eyes now regularly scanned the shoreline, watching, waiting. Oliva had seen him do this before, on the rare occasions when trouble threatened their peaceful harbour. But something felt different this time. The morning continued its slow dance between sea and shore, but now carrying the weight of approaching storm clouds on the horizon. Watching Mick's controlled movements on his boat, Oliva wondered if perhaps the real storm had been here all along, just waiting quietly on a fishing trawler, checking nets and keeping its own counsel. The morning sun had burned away the last wisps of fog when the first real signs of trouble arrived at harbour's edge. Two motorcycles roared down the waterfront, their riders' leather vests bearing the unmistakable emblem of a skull wrapped in chains. They parked near the fish market where Tommy was unloading the morning's catch, their boots striking the wooden boardwalk with deliberate force. The larger of the two, a man with tattoos covering his thick arms, approached Tommy's stand. "Nice catch you got there, kid," he said, picking up a red snapper and examining it with exaggerated care. His companion remained by the bikes, eyes scanning the area with the practiced efficiency of someone used to watching for threats. Tommy continued. His work? Years of helping his father, teaching him to stay calm on unstable ground. $5 a pound, he said evenly, though his hands gripped the ice bucket a bit tighter. Fresh caught this morning. The tattooed man dropped the fish back onto the ice with a wet slap. Thing about fresh fish, he said, leaning closer, is it spoils real quick if it doesn't have proper protection. Lots of accidents can happen on a waterfront. From her office, Oliva watched the scene unfold, her hand already reaching for her phone. Through the window, she saw Mick on his boat, his movements suddenly still as he noticed the confrontation. Even at this distance, she could see how his stance had changed, becoming something both more and less than the fisherman she knew. "We manage fine," Tommy replied, his father's quiet strength evident in his voice, but the tattooed man wasn't listening. Instead, he casually pushed over the ice bucket, sending fish scattering across the boardwalk. "Oops," he grinned, revealing gold-capped teeth. "Like I said, accidents happen. That was a mistake." Mick's voice, soft but carrying an edge that made both bikers turn, came from behind them. Neither had heard him approach, his steps silent. On the wooden planks, he stood between his son and the bikers, his weathered hands relaxed at his sides, but something in his stance made the smaller biker take a half step back. "This your kid?" the tattooed man asked, trying to maintain his bravado. "Should teach him about business, about how small operations like this need protection in tough times." Mick moved slightly, positioning himself more precisely. To most observers, it would have seemed casual, but Oliva, still watching from her window, recognized it as something else, the careful positioning of a predator. "Only thing my son needs protection from," Mick said quietly, is people who think threatening kids makes them strong. The smaller biker's hand dropped toward his jacket, but Mick's next words froze him in place. You think about what's in that jacket real careful, son. Think about whether you're ready to deal with what happens next. Something in his voice, in the absolute certainty it carried, made both bikers hesitate. The tattooed man studied Mick more carefully now, noting the way he stood, the controlled economy of his movements, the eyes that seemed to track everything at once. Just trying to have a business conversation, the tattooed man said, his earlier swagger somewhat diminished. No need to get excited. No excitement here, Mick replied softly. Just a father explaining something simple to his son's uninvited guests. His eyes met the tattooed man's. Some waters run deeper than they look. Some fish know better than to swim in them. Deputy Wilson's patrol boat approached the dock, its timing too perfect to be coincidental. The bikers took the excuse to withdraw, but the tattooed man paused before leaving. Ain't over, old man. Boss is coming. He's got plans for this whole coast. Best learn to swim with the tide. After they roared away, Tommy began picking up the scattered fish. I could have handled them, Dad. Mick helped his son, his movements, once again those of a simple fisherman, though his eyes regularly scanned the waterfront. Some fights aren't about handling them, Tommy. They're about knowing which ones are worth starting. Oliva emerged from her office, joining them at the fish stand. Those weren't just random thugs, she said quietly. Way they moved, way they watched everything. They're scouts. Testing responses, Mick agreed softly, seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back. He turned to Tommy. Starting tomorrow, you work the stand with Ben Peterson. Don't argue, he added as his son started to protest. Some tides you don't swim against, not until you know the currents. Wilson approached, his boots striking the boardwalk with familiar authority. Got word there's more of them checking out other harbors down the coast. They're organized, professional. This isn't just some gang looking for easy money. No, Mick replied, his voice carrying that deadly, quiet Oliva had heard only once before, when a storm had nearly taken 3 boats out to sea. This is something else, something personal. His eyes tracked the direction the bikers had taken, way they carried themselves, way they picked their target. They knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Hayes joined them, medical bag in hand, though his morning fishing was done. Mick, he said softly, might be time to tell Wilson about what happened in the Gulf, about why they called you No. Mick's voice carried a finality that broke no argument. That life's done. Hayes persisted. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, that life might be exactly what this harbor needs right now. Tommy looked between them, confusion clear on his face. Dad, what's he talking about? But Mick was already moving back toward his boat, his steps carrying that fluid grace that spoke of different skills, different times. Oliva watched him go, remembering the rumors she'd heard over the years. Whispers about a team of elite combat divers, about missions so classified their very existence was denied, about a man they called the Ghost of the Gulf, who could appear anywhere in the water, strike without warning, and vanish like a shark in the deep. Oliva found Mick in the engine room of his trawler that evening, his hands moving with mechanical precision over machinery that had never needed this much attention before. She recognized the behavior, a skilled man using routine maintenance to keep his mind focused, his hands busy. Tommy's asking questions, she said softly from the doorway. After what happened today, he has a right to know. Mick's hands never paused in their work, though something in his shoulders tightened slightly. Know what? That his father used to be something else, that there are parts of my past that don't belong in his world. No, Oliva countered, stepping into the cramped space. That the man who taught him to fish, to navigate, to survive at sea is more than just a fisherman, that those lessons came from somewhere deeper. Old Jack Peterson's voice carried down from the deck above. Mick, got something you need to hear." The urgency in the old fisherman's tone brought both of them topside. Jack stood with Dr. Hayes and Deputy Wilson, their faces grave in the failing light. "Just heard from my cousin in Stonebridge Harbor," Jack said without preamble. "That gang that hit them last week, they didn't just take protection money. They took boats too. Good ones, fast ones, deep water capable." "How many?" Mick asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "6 so far," Wilson replied. "All similar to yours. Modified for long-range work, extra fuel capacity, professional radar systems." The evening breeze carried the salt smell of the sea as Mick absorbed this information. His hands moved automatically, coiling a loose rope with perfect precision. "They're not just building a protection racket," he said quietly. "They're building a fleet." "That's not all," Hayes added, his voice dropping lower. "Got word from my colleague over there, the gang's leader, this Steel Jack Morrison. He wasn't just Navy, he was Special Operations, Combat Diver Unit." Oliva watched understanding dawn in Mick's eyes. "Which unit?" "SEAL Team 3, around the time of the Gulf incidents." Mick's hands stilled completely on the rope. The harbor sound seemed to fade as he processed this information, replaced by the weight of old memories. "When?" 2011. "The tanker incident." Tommy emerged from below deck, catching the end of this exchange. "What tanker incident, Dad?" But Mick was already moving, his steps carrying him to the stern where his diving gear lay neatly stowed. His hands moved over the equipment with familiar care, checking seals and gauges with an expertise that spoke of more than just hull maintenance. "Someone gonna tell me what's going on?" Tommy demanded, looking between the gathered adults. "First those bikers, now all these secrets about Dad's past?" Oliva watched Mick's reflection in the wheelhouse windows, saw how his movements had taken on that controlled precision she'd glimpsed earlier. "Your father," she began carefully, "wasn't always a fisherman." "Combat diver," Hayes explained, his eyes never leaving Mick. "One of the best, part of a classified unit that handled things too sensitive for regular teams. They called him Ghost of the Gulf," Wilson finished quietly, "because he could appear anywhere in the water, strike, without warning, disappear like he was never there. Man who could hold his breath longer than anyone thought possible, who could navigate underwater in zero visibility, who could—" "That's enough." Mick's voice carried that deadly quiet that made even Wilson fall silent. He turned to face his son, whose expression wavered between confusion and dawning realization. "Is it true?" Tommy asked softly. "All those times you taught me about currents, about pressure depths, about operating in darkness, that wasn't just fishing knowledge, was it?" Mick studied his son for a long moment, seeing in him shadows of his mother's strength, her ability to face truth without flinching. "No," he finally replied, "wasn't just fishing." "The tanker incident," Hayes pressed gently. "They need to know, Mick, especially if Morrison's involved, especially if he's the one coming." The evening light caught Mick's profile as he leaned against the rail, his eyes distant with memory. "Terrorist cell," he said finally, his voice carrying across the quiet harbor. "Using modified fishing boats to smuggle weapons. Had a tanker, rigged to explode in a major shipping lane. Would have crippled Gulf commerce, caused an environmental disaster." "Your team stopped them," Wilson added. "But something went wrong." "Morrison went wrong," Mick corrected softly. "Wasn't just about stopping terrorists for him, was about power, about proving something, about hurting people who couldn't fight back." His hands gripped the rail slightly. "Had to make a choice that day, between following orders and doing what was right, and Morrison got discharged," Hayes finished. "Lost everything. His career, his reputation, his chance to keep hurting people under the cover of authority." Mick's voice hardened slightly. "Some men join special forces to protect, Others join because it gives them license to be what they really are. Tommy moved closer to his father, seeing him with new eyes. All those diving lessons, the way you taught me to move underwater, to think three-dimensionally, you were teaching me what you learned there, weren't you? Some of it, Mick admitted. The parts about surviving, about reading water and current. Not the parts about killing. Never wanted that for you. Oliva watched understanding spread across Tommy's face as pieces of his childhood suddenly made new sense. His father's insistence on physical training, the emphasis on situational awareness, the countless hours spent learning to read weather and water conditions. Morrison's not just coming here for money, Wilson said grimly. This is personal for him. He spent years building this gang, gathering resources, waiting for a chance at revenge. No, Mick replied, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. He's coming to finish what he started in the Gulf, to prove he was right all along, to show everyone what happens when someone stands against him. The harbour fell silent except for the gentle slap of waves against hulls and the distant cry of seabirds heading to roost. In that quiet moment, watching Mick's controlled movements and alert eyes, Oliva realized that Harbour's Edge hadn't just given sanctuary to a former combat diver seeking peace. It had given him something to protect, something worth fighting for, and now, as darkness settled over the water like a heavy blanket, that protection would be tested in ways none of them had expected. The first hint that everything was about to change came the next morning, as dawn painted Harbour's Edge in shades of gold and steel. 2 more motorcycles roared into town, their riders taking up positions near the waterfront like sentries. Through the morning mist, Oliva watched from her office as they made notes, photographed boats, and studied the harbour's layout with professional scrutiny. Tommy worked the fish stand with Ben Peterson as his father had ordered, but his movements carried a new awareness, his eyes regularly scanning the waterfront just as Mick's did. The morning's catch lay displayed on ice, but fewer customers than usual approached, the presence of leather-clad observers making them hurry past with lowered eyes. "Got more reports," Wilson said quietly, joining Mick on his boat, where he was checking his diving gear with methodical precision. 3 more harbours hit yesterday. They're getting bolder, more organized. Last place, they didn't just take money, they forced the owner to sign over his boat at gunpoint. Mick's hands moved over his equipment with practiced care, each motion calculated and efficient. How many boats now? 12. All fast, all deep water capable, and they've modified them. Extra fuel tanks, reinforced hulls, professional-grade navigation systems. Wilson watched his friend's face carefully. Building. A fleet, just like you said? Not just a fleet, Mick replied softly, his eyes on the harbour entrance where the morning tide was starting to turn. A weapon. Dr. Hayes approached the boat, his medical bag in hand, though he rarely fished anymore. "There's more," he said, his voice carrying urgent tension. "Got word from my contact in naval intelligence. Remember those weapons the terrorists were moving in the Gulf? The ones that disappeared after the tanker incident?" Mick's hands stilled on his gear. "Morrison. Found them. Some of them," Hayes confirmed. "Been stockpiling them all these years, waiting for the right moment. And Mick, he's not just targeting harbours for money. He's building infrastructure, creating safe havens all along the coast." The morning light caught the silver in Mick's hair as he absorbed this information. His movements, always precise, now carried that deadly economy Oliva remembered from the day before. A predator assessing threats, measuring responses. A commotion near the fish market drew their attention. One of the bikers had approached. Tommy's stand, casually knocking over displays, while his partner watched from his bike. Ben Peterson stepped forward, but Tommy held him back, his father's lessons about choosing fights evident in his restraint. "Your old man taught you well, kid," the biker sneered, picking up a large tuna and dropping it deliberately onto the dock. "Teaching you to back down, to stay quiet. Like father, like son, eh?" Mick moved with that fluid grace that spoke of different waters, different times. But before he could reach the market, a new group of motorcycles roared into the harbour, their leather vests bearing the same skull and chains emblem, but their manner carrying more authority. Their leader, a tall man with a greying beard and eyes like cold steel, dismounted with military precision. Even from a distance, Oliver could see how the other bikers deferred to him, how his presence seemed to charge the air with dangerous energy. "Morrison," Wilson breathed, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "Stand down, Mark," Mick said quietly. "Not yet." Morrison surveyed the harbour with calculated interest, his eyes lingering on each boat before finally settling on Mick's trawler. A smile that held no warmth crossed his face as he approached. "Well," he called out, his voice carrying across the water with practiced command. "Ghost of the Gulf himself, living the simple life, playing fisherman. How domesticated you've become." Mick continued his equipment check, each movement measured and precise. "Jack, still hiding behind others, I see. Some things don't change." Morrison's smile never wavered as he stepped onto the dock beside Mick's boat. "Oh, things change, old. A friend. World changes. Lines between right and wrong, legal and illegal, all just a matter of perspective now. Kind of like that day in the Gulf, remember?" "Remember you chose wrong," Mick replied softly. "Remember you forgot what the uniform meant." "The uniform?" Morrison's laugh held no humour. "The uniform was just a tool, Ghost, like you were. Difference is, I admitted what I really was. You're still pretending." Tommy watched this exchange from his stand, seeing his father in a new light as Morrison continued to speak. "Nice operation you've got here," Morrison said, gesturing to the harbour. "Peaceful, profitable. Be a shame if anything happened to it, or to that boy of yours. Got his mother's eyes, doesn't he?" The morning air grew heavy with tension as Mick's movements stilled completely. When he spoke, his voice carried that deadly quiet that made even Morrison's men shift uneasily. "Came all this way, built all this, just to make that mistake?" Mick asked softly. "Threatening my son?" Morrison's smile widened slightly. "No mistake, Ghost. Just making sure you understand what's coming, what happens when someone plays at being ordinary for too long, when they forget what they really are." "I haven't forgotten anything," Mick replied, his eyes meeting Morrison's. "Including what happens to men who threaten children." The harbour held its breath as the two men faced each other, years of history and unfinished business hanging between them like storm clouds gathering at sea. In that moment, Oliver saw what Tommy must be seeing. Not just his quiet father who had taught him about fish and tides, but a warrior who had chosen peace without forgetting how to fight. Morrison turned to leave but paused on the dock. "Got until tomorrow noon to decide, Ghost. Either you and your boy clear out, let nature take its course, or we show this whole harbour what happens when legends try to live ordinary lives." The morning sun continued its climb as Morrison and his men roared away, leaving behind a harbour that suddenly seemed smaller, more vulnerable. But watching Mick return to his equipment check, his movements now carrying that predator's grace she remembered from darker waters, Oliver wondered if perhaps Harbour's Edge wasn't as vulnerable as Morrison thought. Evening shadows lengthened across Harbour's Edge as Mick Callahan moved through his boat with measured precision, checking equipment that hadn't needed such attention in years. His dive gear lay meticulously arranged on deck, rebreathers, depth gauges, underwater communication devices that seemed too sophisticated for simple hull maintenance. Tommy watched from the wheelhouse, seeing his father's movements with new understanding. "That's not just fishing gear, is it?" he asked quietly. "Never was." "No," Mick replied, testing a regulator with practiced care. "Some of it's from before, kept it maintained just in case." "In case of what?" Tommy pressed, but the answer came from the dock where Dr. Hayes approached with urgent news. "Just got word from Stonebridge," Hayes called, boarding with surprising agility for a man his age. Morrison's men. They didn't just take those boats. They've been modifying them, turning them into something else. Mick's hands stilled on his equipment. What kind of modifications? Hidden compartments, reinforced hulls, professional grade, sonar arrays, and something else. Hayes lowered his voice. Remote detonation systems built into the keels, same setup as that tanker in the Gulf. Oliver, who had been listening from the dock, saw understanding dawn in Mick's eyes. He's not just building a fleet, Mick said softly. He's creating weapons, mobile bombs that can slip into any harbor, any shipping lane. Just like he planned. 12 years ago, Wilson added, joining them. But this time, he's got no one watching over his shoulder, no rules of engagement. The evening light caught Mick's profile as he processed this information. His movements had taken on that controlled quality Oliver now recognized, a predator assessing threats, measuring responses. There's more, Hayes continued. Those weapons that disappeared after the tanker incident. Morrison didn't just find them. He's been gathering others, building a network. This isn't just about revenge anymore. No, Mick agreed, his voice carrying that deadly quiet. It's about finishing what he started, about proving he was right all along. Tommy moved closer to his father, studying the dive gear with new eyes. All those lessons about underwater navigation, about operating in zero visibility. You weren't just teaching me to fish, were you? You were teaching me to survive. Before Mick could respond, a commotion from the waterfront drew their attention. 2 of Morrison's men had cornered Ben Peterson's younger brother near the fish market. The boy, only 14, tried to stand his ground as they knocked over his bucket of bait fish. Accidents happen, kid, one biker sneered, his boot crushing. Several fish. Better run home to Big Brother before more accidents happen. Mick was moving before anyone could react, his steps silent on the wooden dock. But this time, something was different in his approach. There was no attempt to appear ordinary, no pretense of being just a fisherman. Each motion carried the fluid grace of a predator in its element. Walk away, Mick said softly, positioning himself between the bikers and the boy, while you still can. The larger biker reached for his jacket, but Mick moved with devastating efficiency. In 2 precise movements, the man found himself face down on the dock, his arm locked behind him at an angle that promised agony if he struggled. Told you about accidents, Mick said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent waterfront. Told you about threatening children. Now you get to deliver a message to Morrison. He released the biker with clinical precision, stepping back as both men scrambled to their feet. Tell him I remember everything. About the Gulf, about what he really is. Tell him I remember what happens to men who target families. After they roared away, Oliver approached Mick, who stood watching the harbor entrance with measured attention. You knew this was coming, didn't you? All these years, maintaining that equipment, teaching Tommy those skills. You were preparing. Some storms, Mick replied softly. You can see gathering long before they hit. Just have to be ready when they break. Wilson joined them, his face grave. Got more reports. Morrison's gathered at least 30 men, all with military or special operations background. They're not just thugs, Mick. They're trained operators. Numbers don't matter, Mick said, his eyes still on the water. Never did. What matters is understanding your enemy, knowing what drives them. He turned to face Wilson. Morrison thinks he's hunting here, thinks he's the predator. He's forgotten something important. What's that? Tommy asked, standing beside his father. That some waters run deeper than others. That some predators don't. Hunt for pleasure or profit. Mick's voice carried that deadly certainty Oliver remembered. They hunt to protect what's theirs. The evening deepened as Harbor's Edge prepared for night, but there was a different quality to the darkness now. Oliver watched as Mick moved through his final equipment checks, saw how his movements had fully transformed from those of a fisherman to something more primal, more dangerous. "You're going to fight them, aren't you?" Tommy said. "Not really a question." "No," Mick replied, his eyes meeting his son's. "Going to teach them something they've forgotten. About why they called me Ghost. About what happens when you threaten a man's family." Dr. Hayes approached with one final piece of information. "Morrison's men. They're not just gathering here. They're positioning boats all along the coast, creating a network. If they succeed—" "They won't," Mick said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "because they've made two mistakes. They've forgotten what I am, what I can do." His eyes found Tommy's again, "and they've threatened something I'd die to protect." The harbour fell silent, except for the gentle lap of waves against hulls and the distant cry of nightbirds. In that quiet moment, watching Mick's controlled movements and alert eyes, Oliva realized that Harbour's Edge was about to learn why some legends never truly fade. They just wait quietly, watching over what they love until the day darkness forces their hand. Dawn approached Harbour's Edge with streaks of blood-red clouds, painting the water in shades of crimson that seemed to presage the coming storm. Mick Callahan moved through the pre-dawn darkness with fluid grace, his steps silent on the wooden docks as he made his final preparations. The harbour lay quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath, of nature sensing approaching violence. Tommy found his father in the water, checking something beneath the pilings that supported the main dock. Even in the dim light, he could see how his father moved through the water, not with a fisherman's practical efficiency, but with the liquid grace of something born to the depths. "You aren't planning to just defend, are you?" Tommy asked, as Mick surfaced silently beside the dock. "You're setting up something else." Mick pulled himself from the water with controlled precision, his movements economical and predatory. "Morrison expects defense," he replied softly. "Expects me to react, to protect. Men like that, he's forgotten the first rule of underwater combat." "What's that?" "Real predators don't wait to be hunted." Mick's voice carried that deadly quiet that made even the morning breeze seem to still. "They choose the time, the place, the depth of engagement." Oliva approached from her office, her face tight with concern. "Just got word from Stonebridge. 3 more boats taken in the night. Professional job. Security systems disabled, crews subdued before they knew what was happening." "How many does that make now?" Wilson asked, joining them with his morning coffee forgotten in his hand. 18, Mick replied, his eyes scanning the harbour entrance where the first light was beginning to strengthen. "All fast, all deep water capable, all modified for Morrison's purpose." Dr. Hayes arrived with fresh intelligence, his medical bag seeming incongruous with the tension in the air. "My contact in naval intelligence came through. Those modified boats, they're not just carrying weapons. Each one's been rigged with enough explosives to take out a cruise ship." "Mobile bombs," Wilson breathed. "He could slip them into any port, any shipping lane." "Could," Mick agreed quietly. "If he gets past here, if he establishes his network." His hands moved over his diving gear with practiced care. "If we let him." The sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the morning air. Through the strengthening light, they watched as more of Morrison's men took up positions around the harbour, their movements carrying military precision. "They're sealing off approaches," Wilson observed, "setting up firing positions, controlling access points." "Like they were taught," Mick replied, his voice carrying something that made Tommy look at his father sharply. "But they've forgotten something important about those lessons." "What's that?" "That sometimes the best defense," Mick's hands stilled on his equipment, "is making your enemy focus on the wrong water." A new motorcycle approached, its rider larger than the others. The enforcer they'd learned he was called, Morrison's head of security. He dismounted with practiced efficiency, his movements speaking of special operations training. "Time's running out, Ghost," he called across the water. "Boss says you've got 2 hours. Either you and the boy clear out, let things take their natural course, or we show this whole harbor what happens when people forget their place." Mick continued his equipment check, each motion measured and precise. "Natural course," he replied, softly, though his voice carried clearly across the water. "Like what happened in the Gulf, like what Morrison planned for that tanker." The enforcer's stance shifted slightly. "You don't know anything about that. You weren't there for the end." "Wasn't I?" Mick's hands moved over his rebreather with deadly efficiency. "Ask Morrison about the shadow he saw in the water that night, about the ghost that followed him after the explosion failed, about why he really lost his command." Something changed in the enforcer's bearing, a tensing that spoke of recognition and old fear. "2 hours," he repeated, but his voice carried less certainty now. "Boss wants you to know he's got plans for that boy of yours. Special plans." The morning air grew heavy with dangerous potential as Mick's movement stilled completely. When he spoke, his voice carried that deadly quiet that made even hardened operators step back. "Tell Morrison something for me," he said softly. "Tell him I remember everything, about the Gulf, about what he really is." His eyes met the enforcer's. "Tell him I remember what happens to men who threaten children." The enforcer mounted his bike, but paused before starting it. "You can't protect everyone, Ghost. Can't be everywhere at once. And we've got something special planned for tonight. Something to remind this whole coast what happens when people don't respect the natural order." After he roared away, Dr. Hayes approached with grave news. "Just got word. Morrison's men didn't just take those boats. They've been moving something else into position. Something big." "The weapons from the Gulf," Mick said quietly. "The ones that disappeared after the tanker incident." "Not just those," Hayes replied. "More, newer, enough to arm a small navy." He studied his friend carefully. "This isn't just about revenge anymore, is it? Morrison's building something bigger." "Always was," Mick agreed, his eyes scanning the harbor with predatory focus. "Revenge is just his cover. Man like that, he needs to prove something, needs to show he was right all along." The morning light strengthened as Harbor's edge awakened to its new reality. But watching Mick's controlled movements, seeing how he operated with lethal precision in both air and water, Oliva realized that Morrison had made a crucial mistake. He'd forgotten that some predators don't need to hide their nature. They just wait, watching over what they love until the moment comes to remind the world why they earned their legends in the first place. Mid-morning sun glittered across harbors. Edge as Morrison's forces continued their methodical takeover of the waterfront. More bikes arrived hourly, their riders moving with military precision to secure key points around the harbor. Through it all, Mick Callahan worked with measured care on his boat, his movements carrying that predator's grace that spoke of different waters, different battles. "Nat's 15 now," Wilson reported quietly, watching another group of bikers take up positions near the fish market. All ex-military or special operations. They're setting up overlapping fields of fire, controlling every approach. Mick's hands moved over his diving gear with practiced efficiency. "Not every approach," he replied softly. "They're thinking like land operators, forgetting about what's beneath." Oliva watched from her office as Morrison's men began checking boats, their inspections carrying professional thoroughness. But she noticed how they gave Mick's trawler a wide berth, how their eyes skittered away from his measured movements. "Got something," Hayes called urgently, hurrying down the dock with his phone in hand. "Just heard from my contact. That weapons cache Morrison's been gathering? It's not just guns. They found plans in one of his safe houses, detailed schematics for modifying civilian boats into mobile explosive platforms." "Like the tanker," Mick said quietly, his hands stilling on his equipment, "but smaller, harder to detect. Dozens of them," Hayes confirmed, "all rigged to detonate remotely." one in every major harbor along the coast. He's not just building a criminal empire, he's creating chaos, Mick finished, threatening every port, every shipping lane, making himself indispensable to people who'd pay to avoid such threats. Tommy emerged from below deck, his face tight with controlled anger. They're threatening Ben's family now, saying they'll burn their boat if they don't clear out by sunset. The morning light caught Mick's profile as he absorbed this information. His movements had taken on that deadly economy of motion that Oliva now recognized. A hunter preparing to strike. "Time to tell them, Mick," Hayes said quietly. "About what really happened in the Gulf. About why Morrison's really here." Mick stood perfectly still for a moment, his eyes scanning the harbor with predatory focus. Finally, he turned to his son. "That tanker incident 12 years ago. It wasn't just about stopping terrorists. Morrison had bigger plans." "What kind of plans?" Tommy asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. He was building his own operation, using his position, his authority, to create something bigger. The terrorists were just his cover. Mick's voice carried that deadly quiet that made even the morning breeze seem to still. "When I discovered the truth, when I saw what he was really planning, you stopped him," Wilson finished. "Cost him everything. His command, his reputation, his chance to build an empire." "Should have cost him more," Mick replied softly. "Should have finished it then. Instead, I let him live, let him run." His eyes found Tommy's. "Thought I was showing mercy. Instead, I just gave him time to grow stronger, to become something worse." A commotion near the harbor entrance drew their attention. Morrison himself had arrived, flanked by his core team. They moved with practiced coordination, their formation speaking of shared combat experience. "Look at you," Morrison called. Across the water, his voice carrying command presence. "Still playing at being ordinary, still pretending you're just another fisherman." His smile held no warmth. "Tell me, Ghost, does your boy know what you really are? What you're really capable of?" Mick's stance shifted slightly, becoming something both more and less than human. He knows what matters, knows the difference between soldiers and predators, between protectors and parasites. Morrison's laugh carried across the harbor. "Protector, is that what you're calling it now?" He gestured to his men. "See, boys? This is what happens when legends try to play at being ordinary. They forget what they really are." "Haven't forgotten." "Anything?" Mick replied, his voice carrying that edge that made even hardened operators step back. "Including what happens to men who threaten families." "Families?" Morrison's smile widened. "Like that family you couldn't save in the Gulf? The ones who died because you were too slow, too cautious, too bound by rules?" The morning air grew heavy, with dangerous potential, as Mick's hands stilled completely on his gear. Oliva saw something cross his face. Not anger, but a cold certainty that made her shiver. "You want to do this, Jack?" Mick asked softly. "Want to remind everyone what really happened that day? About who really killed those people?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "You've got 1 hour, Ghost. 1 hour to clear out, to take your boy and run. After that," he gestured to the harbor, "after that, we show everyone what happens when legends try to hide from what they are." As Morrison and his men withdrew, Hayes approached with grim determination. "It's starting, isn't it? What you've been preparing for all these years." "No," Mick replied, his eyes never leaving Morrison's retreating form. "What's starting is something else, something Morrison's forgotten about." "What's that?" Tommy asked, standing beside his father. "Why they really called me Ghost," Mick said, quietly. "Not because I could kill without being seen, because I could appear anywhere in the water, at any depth." His voice carried absolute certainty. "Because to the people I hunted, I wasn't just a shadow. I was their worst nightmare coming to life." The morning continued to strengthen as Harbor's Edge held its breath, watching 2 predators circle each, other in increasingly tight spirals. But Oliva observing Mick's controlled movements and deadly grace, realized that Morrison had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd forgotten that some legends don't fade. They just wait, watching over what they love, until the moment comes to remind the world why they earned their names in the first place. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Harbour's Edge as Morrison's forces completed their takeover of the waterfront. 20 armed men now controlled key positions around the harbour, their military training evident in their disciplined movements and coordinated communications. Through it all, Mick Callahan continued his methodical preparations, each motion carrying that predator's grace that spoke of darker waters. "They're moving something into position," Wilson reported quietly, watching through binoculars as Morrison's men unloaded heavy equipment from unmarked vans. Professional gear, underwater sensors, sonar arrays. "Trying to deny me the water," Mick replied softly, his hands moving over his rebreather with practiced care. "Forgetting something important about hunting in the deep." "What's that?" Tommy asked, helping his father check oxygen levels with the precision he'd been taught. "That technology can't replace instinct, can't replace years of knowing every current, every depth." Mick's voice carried that deadly quiet. "Can't replace understanding how predators really think." Oliva watched from her office as Morrison's men began installing their equipment along the harbour walls, but she noticed something in their movements. A tension, an unease that spoke of men who knew they were being watched by something they couldn't see. "Got confirmation," Hayes called urgently, approaching with fresh intelligence. "Those modified boats Morrison's been gathering, they're not just rigged with explosives. They're carrying something else, something from the Gulf." Mick's hands stilled on his equipment. "The bioweapon?" Hayes nodded grimly. "The same one he tried to acquire 12 years ago. The one that disappeared after the tanker incident." His voice dropped lower. "He's been manufacturing it, Mick, creating his own supply." The afternoon light caught Mick's profile as he absorbed this information. His movements had taken on that measured quality that Oliva now recognized, a hunter assessing bigger prey. It was never just about revenge, Wilson realized. The boats, the weapons, the takeover of harbors, it's all infrastructure for something larger. "Always was," Mick agreed quietly. "Morrison's building what he always wanted. A network that can threaten any port, any shipping lane. Power without accountability. Terror for profit." A commotion near the fish market drew their attention. The enforcer was questioning Ben Peterson's father, his manner carrying calculated menace. "Heard you were Navy once," the enforcer said, his voice carrying across the water. "Means you should understand how things work. Natural hierarchy, chain of command." "Only thing I understand," Peterson replied, "is the difference between soldiers and thugs." The enforcer's hand moved toward his jacket, but Mick was already in motion. His approach carried that fluid grace that made even hardened operators step back. "Still making the same mistakes," Mick said softly, positioning himself between Peterson and the enforcer. "Still threatening people who can't fight back." The enforcer's hand stopped its movement, but his smile remained. "Boss wants you to know. We found something interesting in those old Gulf files, about what really happened to that family you couldn't save." The afternoon air grew heavy with dangerous potential as Mick's stance shifted slightly. "Tell Morrison something for me," he replied, his voice carrying that edge that made even the enforcer tense. "Tell him I remember everything, about the family he killed, about the weapon he tried to steal, about why he really lost his command." After the enforcer withdrew, Hayes approached with fresh concern. "They're not just watching the water, Mick. They're preparing for something specific, something big." "Know what it is," Mick replied, his eyes scanning the harbor with predatory focus. "Morrison's recreating that day in the Gulf, setting the same kind of trap, thinking he can control the outcome this time." "What happened that day?" Tommy asked, standing beside his father. What really happened to that family? Mick stood perfectly still for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. Morrison had arranged everything. The terrorists, the tanker, the bioweapon, all pieces. In his game. But there was a family on the water that day, local fishermen who'd seen too much. He killed them. Tommy's voice carried controlled anger. Tried to make it look like an accident, like they'd gotten caught in the crossfire. Mick's voice hardened slightly. But I saw him, saw what he really was, what he's always been. A predator who hunts the helpless. Wilson finished. No, Mick corrected quietly. Something worse. A man who thinks his power gives him the right to decide who lives and dies. His eyes found Tommy's. Man who never learned the most important lesson about real strength was what's that? That it exists to protect, not to dominate. To serve, not to control. Mick's voice carried absolute certainty. Lesson Morrison's about to learn again. The afternoon continued to deepen as Harbour's Edge watched two hunters circle each other with increasing intent. Morrison's men maintained their positions, their equipment humming with electronic surveillance, but Oliva noticed how they jumped at shadows, how their eyes constantly searched the water's surface. They're afraid, she realized, watching their tense movements, not just of what you might do, but of what you represent. Should be, Mick replied softly, his hands moving over his gear with deadly precision. Because Morrison's forgotten something crucial about that day in the Gulf, something he never understood. What's that? Hayes asked. That real ghosts don't haunt places out of habit or history. Mick's voice carried that quiet certainty that made even Wilson straighten. They haunt them because something precious needs protecting, something worth becoming a nightmare for. The sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across water that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. But watching Mick's controlled movements, seeing how he operated with lethal grace in both air and water, Oliva realized that Morrison had made a fundamental error in judgment. He'd forgotten that some legends don't fade because of time or distance. They endure because they're not just stories. They're warnings about what happens when darkness threatens what a ghost has chosen to protect. Evening approached Harbour's Edge with a stillness that felt like the ocean drawing back before a tsunami. Morrison's men had established complete control of the waterfront, their military precision evident in their coordinated movements and strategic positions. But through their professional facade, Oliva could see an underlying tension, the unease of hunters who suddenly suspected they might be prey. Got movement on the water, Wilson reported quietly, watching through his binoculars as sleek boats appeared at the harbour entrance. 4 vessels, heavily modified, professional crews. The weapon platforms, Mick said softly, his hands moving over his diving gear with lethal efficiency. Morrison's bringing them into position. Tommy studied the approaching boats with the careful attention his father had taught him. They're running dark, minimal electronics, like they're expecting someone in the water, Mick finished, his voice carrying that deadly quiet. Someone who knows how to hunt beneath the surface. Dr. Hayes approached with urgent news, his medical bag now containing more than just standard supplies. Just intercepted communications between Morrison's teams. They're not just positioning those boats for show, they're creating a killing zone. Using the harbour itself as a trap, Wilson added grimly. They've got underwater sensors, depth charges, anti-diver nets, standard countermeasures, Mick replied, his movements never pausing as he checked his rebreather. Standard thinking. That's their mistake. Oliva watched as Morrison himself arrived at the waterfront, his presence carrying the authority of a man used to controlling the battlefield. His core team moved with professional coordination, establishing a command post near the fish market. Last chance, ghost, Morrison called across the water, his voice carrying that false friendliness that set everyone's teeth on edge. You've seen what we brought, what we've prepared. Walk away now, take your boy. Let nature take its course. Mick continued his preparations, each motion measured and precise. "Nature," he replied softly, though his voice carried clearly across the harbour. "Like what you did to that family in the Gulf? Like what you're planning for every port on this coast?" Morrison's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes. Still thinking like a soldier ghost, still believing in right and wrong, in protecting the innocent, he gestured to his assembled force. "World's changed. Power makes its own rules now." "World hasn't changed," Mick corrected quietly. "Just the masks people wear, the lies they tell themselves." "Lies?" Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Look around you, Ghost. Look at what I've built, what I've created. While you were playing fisherman, hiding from what you are, I was embracing my true nature." "Your true nature," Mick's hands stilled on his equipment. "Like what you showed. That day in the Gulf, when you murdered a family to cover your crimes." The evening air grew heavy with dangerous potential as Morrison's smile finally faltered. "That family made their choice, like you're making yours now, like your boy's going. To learn about choices and consequences." The harbour fell silent as Mick's movement stilled completely. When he spoke, his voice carried that edge that made even hardened operators step back. "You made two mistakes, Jack," he said softly. "You forgot why they really called me Ghost, and you threatened my son." A new tension filled the air as Morrison's men shifted uneasily, their training warring with instinct, the deep-seated knowledge that they were in the presence of something deadly. "Got reports from up the coast," Hayes said urgently, checking his phone. "More of Morrison's boats moving into position. They're creating a network, just like you said. Mobile weapons platforms in every major harbour." "His real plan," Mick agreed quietly. "Using crime and terror to build an empire, making himself necessary to people who'd pay to avoid chaos." Tommy watched the approaching boats with growing understanding. All those lessons about water pressure, about operating in darkness. You were preparing me, weren't you? Teaching me how to survive what's coming. "Teaching you something more important," Mick replied, his eyes meeting his son's. "About why we protect what matters, about the difference between power and strength." Morrison's voice cut through the gathering darkness. "1 hour, Ghost. 1 hour to clear out, to run like you should have 12 years ago. After that—" He gestured to his assembled force, to the boats now positioned at the harbour entrance. "After that, we remind everyone why some legends should stay buried." As Morrison withdrew to his command post, Oliva approached Mick's boat. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? All these years, maintaining that equipment, teaching Tommy those skills, you were getting ready. Some storms," Mick replied softly, "you can see gathering long before they break, just have to be prepared when they hit." Wilson joined them, his face grave. "They've got every approach covered, Mick, every contingency planned for. They're expecting a ghost in the water." "Expecting," Mick agreed quietly, his hands moving over his gear with deadly precision, "but expecting the wrong thing. Thinking like soldiers, like operators, forgetting something crucial about real ghosts." "What's that?" Tommy asked, standing. "Beside his father. That we don't haunt places out of habit or history." Mick's voice carried that quiet certainty that made even Wilson straighten. "We haunt them because something precious needs protecting, something worth becoming a nightmare for." The evening deepened as Harbour's Edge held its breath, watching two predators prepare for their final confrontation. But observing Mick's controlled movements, seeing how he operated with lethal grace in both air and water, Oliva realized that Morrison had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd forgotten that some legends don't fade because of time or distance. They endure because they're not just stories. They're warnings about what happens when darkness threatens what a ghost has chosen to protect. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us.